Star Wars descended from on high in 1977, dropped from the fertile mind bosom of George Lucas. But 1977 was a while ago, way before I was born, which means I don't know a world without Star Wars. And like anything that's been around for almost half a century, Star Wars has changed in both form and feature. Star Wars first iterated with world-class practical effects and ingenious camera work. Then it soireed into huge-scale epic CGI effects. We've had holiday specials, 5-minute micro-features, video games, comics, novels, and I've heard that there was even a bootleg musical. Star Wars is so big and so ingrained in Western culture that it couldn't help but chameleonize itself to appear as broadly as possible. But one way that Star Wars has never presented is as anime. But I guess honestly it was only a matter of time before that happened too. Cue Star Wars Visions, a 9-episode anime anthology series. But hey, if you clicked on this video, you probably already knew that. And it's kind of funny that it took so long for this to happen because I believe anime is everything Star Wars is meant to be. But I'm not just here to gush. What I want to do is talk about the writing of Star Wars Visions, why it succeeds, and how we all might learn to better our own skills and understanding when it comes to creative writing. Now, one of the things that I noticed after getting deeper into the series was the type of stories being told. Or I guess more specifically, the size of the stories. The Duel is about the endangerment and rescue of a small town. The Elder is about hunting down a lone man of mystery. Toby is about a young droid fighting a Sith to realize his true potential, and there are plenty of other episodes that are small, nearly intimate in their scope and scale. And of course, for anyone who knows Star Wars, that's typically not how the series functions from a narrative perspective. Back in 1977, Star Wars was purposely conceived to depict the grand, galaxy-wide battle between good and evil. Nearly every single one of the theatrical releases for Star Wars has been quite large in scope and scale, and many of the supporting non-theatrical material has been as well. But Star Wars Visions is different. The storytelling is still undoubtedly Star Wars, which means it has the backdrop of a big war with conflict, but the focus of these episodes and the narratives within are much smaller than what has come before. And I think it's that small scope and scale that, no pun intended, largely contribute to making Star Wars Visions such an engaging breath of fresh air. But I think to fully appreciate this aspect of the fiction, we have to unpack scope and scale, a narrative concept that can sometimes be very difficult for both writers and consumers of fiction to recognize because it's not typically how we are taught to think about narratives. But something that has helped me and the clients that I work with is to think of scope and scale as being two distinct narrative elements that work together. We can consider scope to be the focus of the conflict, what we see as the center of the narrative. Since conflict in fiction is whatever is standing in the way of a character achieving their goal, the scope is therefore that struggle that they're dealing with. For an example, let's look to Anakin in The Phantom Menace. His goal was to free himself and his mother from slavery. To accomplish this, he needed to win a race, and Sebulba stood as the primary opposition, making him the antagonist. This race for freedom is the scope of Anakin's conflict. It is what his narrative journey is centered on. Scale can be understood as all the other people, places, or things affected by the conflict. Basically, scale is how large the consequences concerning the struggles of the characters are. To give another Star Wars example, Rogue One had a large scale to its conflict. The fate of hundreds of billions of lives and thousands of planets hung in the balance, based off whether or not the main characters could overcome the conflict surrounding the Death Star schematics. So, if scope is the focus of the conflict, and scale is everything affected by the conflict, how do they interact with each other? Well, it's kind of a loaded question because every genre of storytelling handles scope and scale differently, but if we're talking about epic adventure narratives, which the theatrical Star Wars films definitely are, you ideally want a small scope and a big scale. Now, why do I say this? Let's think about it like this. When I say a small scope, I do not mean that the conflict should be unimportant or non-threatening. The scope, what's the center of the narrative, should be quote unquote small insofar as it's based in the personal struggles of the characters. Characters need to be in battle not just externally, but internally. Centering your narrative on how characters are changing, adapting, and evolving is key to telling a compelling, emotional story, because it's those things that we as an audience connect to. Now, for the scale for an epic adventure, the people and places affected by the conflict, that should be big. And not only should it be big, it should be directly related to the personal struggles of the main character, i.e., the scope. This translates to mean that if the main characters do not overcome their personal journeys, there will be consequences for others. This is the bedrock of epic adventures. An example of this outside of Star Wars is Avatar: The Last Airbender. A lot of people think that Aang's conflict in the show is defeating Ozai and the Fire Nation, and on some level, that is correct. But the true conflict of the show, from beginning to end, is how Aang's journey to becoming a fully realized Avatar stands at odds with his own personal wishes, morals, and convictions. By the finale of the show, Aang is told over and over that the only way to stop Ozai is to kill him. But Aang is 100% against killing, and therein lies the conflict. Aang is just as much in conflict with himself as he is with the Fire Nation. That's the scope. And if Aang cannot defeat Ozai, thousands will die. That's the scale. And this is the number one spot where I see clients mess up. They know that consumers of fiction become invested in high stakes, but they then mistakenly think that large scale equals high stakes. They think if I put the setting itself in danger, the stakes are as high as they can be. But stakes in a narrative are not dictated by how many people are affected, but by who is affected. And that who must always be characters who the audience cares about. And that care can only be built up by putting a character in understandable personal conflict. And as I said before, the core theatrical releases of Star Wars have always been created with large scale in mind. The whole point is that it's a war across the stars. You can't get much larger scale than that. But the scope of Star Wars is what has changed over the years. The original trilogy, while definitely showcasing a massive war, focused very closely on Luke Skywalker's journey of good and evil, of his temptation by the dark side, and his eventual stand against it. Alongside Luke's journey, you had Han and Leia at the center as well, but all things considered, the scope of the story was always relatively small. The direction was always centered on Luke and who he would become. The prequel trilogy changes things up by keeping the grand wartime scale, but also expanding the scope. We are no longer focused exclusively on one central plotline across 3 films, but multiple different plot lines. Of course, Anakin's descent into the dark side is still the most important element, but we also have the pod race to end slavery, trade federations, Obi-Wan's relationship with Qui-Gon, the creation and funding of a clone army, Naboo politics, Coruscant politics, and Palpatine's coup. Anakin's journey to becoming Vader shares the space with all of these narrative elements to make up the conflict of the trilogy, and so by definition, the scope grows to accommodate. And with a wider scope means less time to focus on any one individual character or their journey. We learn less about the characters' personal struggles and focus more on how they are dealing with the external conflict. And then, the sequel trilogy takes it to a whole other level by exploding the scope to basically have it be on par with the huge scale. Rey, Finn, and Poe's journey basically comes down to save the galaxy. Nearly the entirety of what the characters are journeying to accomplish, both externally and internally, is save the galaxy. Poe is an ambitious rebel leader who wants to prove himself through a deep yearning to save the galaxy. Finn is a former stormtrooper who switches to fight for the rebel side because he wants to save the galaxy. And Rey endeavors to discover her identity and heritage, only to learn that she is a tool to destroy the galaxy. So in defiance of that fate, she saves the galaxy. Now, this is not a commentary on whether these films are enjoyable, nor am I saying that Finn, Poe, and Rey are bad characters, but what I am saying is that the personal struggles for these characters aren't the center of the story. The conflict of the narrative is centered on the imperilment of the galaxy, and while that large scope and scale does make for epic storytelling, it limits the character's personal growth and development. Still, there is nothing wrong with having a big scope and a big scale for a story. It's just that the larger your scope, meaning the focus of your character's conflicts, the more time you need to develop it. Game of Thrones had a monumental scope to go along with its scale, but that show ran for 60 hours. The final two Avengers movies had massive scopes, but also had 40 hours of previous material to build on. Each of the Star Wars trilogies are 7 hours at the most, and deal with characters and conflicts that would take much more time to properly develop. This is why many of the most critically acclaimed, fan-beloved Star Wars fictions aren't movies. They are video games and television series with dozens of hours to properly construct that large scope to go with the large scale. But Star Wars Visions is different from so many other previous entries in the franchise, because it's not trying to have a large scope and a large scale. Instead of hours of runtime or multiple seasons to build up storylines, Visions' stories are 15 to 20 minutes, and that's it. As stated before, many of the stories within are small, both in the personal nature of the conflict and in the people and places who are being affected, at least by Star Wars standards. Gone are the days of saving entire solar systems or galaxies. Rather, Visions gives us a deep look at the friction and struggle between just a few people and the communities they touch. And a small scope and scale has functional demands and benefits for a narrative too. These smaller stories don't need exposition or build-up because there is literally not time. The storytelling structure is very reminiscent of the Clone Wars micro-series that didn't world build or drop backstory, it just showed you and trusted what was on screen was good enough to hold your attention. But where the Clone Wars micro-series was specifically made to focus on the large-scale, all-consuming nature of war, what Visions attempts to highlight is much smaller and more personal. And it's also why I think the anime styling has served the series so well. In my last video about the Clone Wars micro-series, I mentioned the legendary Pixar director Brad Bird and his views on animation. Here they are again.
And that's not the reason to do animation anyway. The reason to do it is caricature. It means reducing something to its essence. So it becomes this, it's almost like boiled down to its essence. Well, animators do that not only with the style of how something looks, but how it moves.
Animation isn't just about making things pretty. It's about using exaggeration and excess to depict something as more of itself. The Clone Wars micro-series used animation to show the overwhelming power of the Jedi and their enemies in a way that live action couldn't get away with. But Visions takes it one step further. Anime's specialty as an artistic medium isn't about just exaggerating action, it's about stylizing emotion. Anime takes that caricature that Brad Bird talks about and cranks it up to 11-teen. It animates feelings, it gives visuals to emotions, it stylizes personal conflict. And Visions uses its small scope and scale to interrogate the personal conflict at the very center of Star Wars, battling the darkness within. When Star Wars debuted in 1977, it appeared to depict a struggle of objective good versus objective evil. It was introduced as literally the dark side versus the light side. But it soon became clear that there was a gray area within the narrative, that good could be seduced by evil, and that evil could be redeemed by good. This push and pull is the core of Star Wars, and it's why Visions works so well. The dark side isn't embodied by obviously evil megalomaniacs. In Visions, the dark side is people that we trust, people that we grew up with, people that we love. And the dark side isn't always evil for evil's sake. Sometimes these people are doing what they think is truly best, or doing what they think they were born to do. Sometimes what we think is dark is heroic, and sometimes dark isn't dark at all. It is not that these stories have never been told in Star Wars before, but they had not been told through this small of a scope and scale, nor visualized through this medium before. These stories aren't concerned with laying the groundwork for future installments or pandering to past iterations. These small stories seek to connect to us not through war and galactic doom, but through the personal pitfalls of people and the hardships that we might see in ourselves. It's the core of Star Wars, the personal struggle beneath the battle amongst the stars. The stylization of anime allows us to witness the weight of these emotions and conflicts and all the gravity that they demand, and the short runtime means that we stay centered on what is truly important. Star Wars Visions is a look into a well-known fiction through a lens not used before, but one that hopefully will become much more frequent. I have never lived in a world without Star Wars, and I have enjoyed the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. But after seeing what I have, I think that this is what Star Wars was always meant to be. Anyway, thank you all for watching all the way until the end. If you like what you heard, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to be a real homie, support on Patreon, check out my books on my website, or hop on over to the second channel. Links will be in the description. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will talk to you all again soon.